Thank you for watching the Stanfords Travel Writers Festival 2021. Joining us now is Dan Richards, talking with Paul Blezard.
Well, hello everybody, and a very warm welcome to the online Edward Stanford Travel Writing Festival for 2021, where we are endeavouring to remain fully socially distanced, and I've only just taken my mask off, so even my screen should be still infected. We hope you're looking after yourself, we hope you're well, hope you're washing your hands and wearing a mask when appropriate, and we hope that you're coping with this most strange of new years. I'm delighted to introduce you today to our first guest, who is Dan Richards, the co-author of Holloway, co-written with Robert Macfarlane and Stanley Donwood. He's also the author of The Beechwood Airship, Interviews and Climbing Days, and has written for The Guardian, The Economist, Harper's Bazaar, Caught by the River, Monocle, and The Quietus. Dan, whereabouts in the world are you? Where do we find you? Are you well?
Yes, thank you very much. I'm up in Edinburgh. Everything is fine. It's quite quiet, but I was able to go out and get a coffee. And you have to make your own entertainment and take joy in small things at the moment. So, you know, that's a delight. But everything is okay. I'm walking around. We had some snow. I built a snowman. Pretty great.
Not a bad start to 2021 for you. We're here to talk about your latest book, which is entitled Outpost, A Journey to the Wild Ends of the Earth. So let's crack on. What do you understand an outpost to mean? What is an outpost defined as, and how did you interpret that?
An outpost when I was growing up was, I guess, synonymous with the idea of a den. And as I grew a bit older, it became sort of intertwined with ideas of bivouacking and sort of camping out. And my previous book that you mentioned, Climbing Days, I spent quite a lot of time up quite high in mountains and discovered this amazing array of cabins that they have in the Alps and around the world. And they're the most amazing places that people perhaps have never considered. And the idea of being away from the main scheme of things and having quite specific dwellings or springboards, as I came to think of them, to adventure, really inspired me from the climbing book to look sort of more widely and around the world again, to see, you know, the different sorts of beacons or watchtowers or cabins or refuges that kind of existed, and begin to try and unpack their stories a bit.
You make reference to Climbing Days, which I have to confess was my first introduction to reading your writing, and a book I'm still so incredibly fond of. Can you just give us a little bit of a précis of that, because you're sort of following in the footsteps of one of your forebears?
Yes, no, absolutely. So my great aunt was a wonderful woman called Dorothy Pilley, and she was a pioneering journalist and mountaineer. And she started climbing in the 1910s, and became sort of like rapidly became this sort of force within the mountaineering world. She co-founded the Pinnacle Club in 1921, which was the world's first climbing club by women for women. And she spent a lot of the 20s and 30s pioneering new routes with her husband, the literary critic I.A. Richards. So they were really a sort of powerhouse couple in that way. And she wrote a memoir of all her adventures with and without Iva, which was published in 1935. And so my book was really, rather than a recapitulation of that book, I tried to follow, as you say, in their footsteps and handholds and tell their story, because, you know, Iva is known as a very cerebral chap and Dorothy is known hardly at all. So it felt like this great sort of vacuum, not just within the family, because I don't think my family really appreciated the extent of their endeavor, but also the world at large, because, you know, they influenced a great many people. And Dorothy was such I suppose she instigated other amazing women to climb in her, you know, in her footsteps.
Did you ever meet her or know her?
Sadly not. She was very long-lived, and she was born in the late 1800s and died in the late 1900s. She died, no, sorry, that's wrong entirely, isn't it? She was born in she was born in 1890 something, and she died in 1986, and I was 4. So that's super sad, because I would have loved to meet her. But the wonderful thing of writing the book, I made the discovery that she had 2 nephews, I had no idea they existed. And Anthony and Chris lives now about half a mile away from me in Edinburgh. And I took several trips over to meet Anthony, who's an amazing artist. He looks like a slightly scrumpled Picasso in Barcelona. And so I discovered, new sides to the family I had no idea about, and that was delightful. That was one of the most amazing things that came out of the book.
I remember one of the things I took away from that book is just the amount of pride you had that she was one of your relations, and I've always had that sort of sneaking suspicion that had the two of you ever met, you'd have really, really got on, and that she would in turn have been incredibly proud to have had you as a great great nephew. I have that sort of overabiding sense. I'm mentioning her in this previous book in this context because in your latest book she makes a rather surprising appearance, which perhaps we'll in book form, which we'll perhaps talk about later. So that was your definition of outposts. How do you plan? Do you plan a book like this? Do you just think, now, where do I need to go? Or is it a question of where do I want to go? Because you take us from Utah to the Cascades, to Scotland, to Japan, to a shed boat shed, all sorts of places. So it's sort of outposts mentally and artistically as much as it is geographically, is how I put it.
Yes. And I think you hit on something important there, because I always think about building books or perhaps collaging them together rather than sitting down to write. Um, Often a book for me begins with a back of an envelope kind of list, a sort of a list of what may be impossible, but what I'd like to do. And I got to most of the places on that list within Outpost. But there are a few notable places that I couldn't go, some for logistical reasons and some for almost philosophical reasons. Because as a book grows, it changes and it begins to tell you what it wants to be, I think. So it has to be an organic thing, and you almost have to go with it to some degree. And there are quite a few digressions, which anybody who's read any of my other books will not be that surprised with. But there are quite a few side roads that turned out to be really wonderfully important sort of destinations, because my idea of travel is always that it shouldn't be about the destination, to the detriment of the journey. And this is really a book of journeys, and I discover things along the way because I always try and be the big eye and the big ear. I, in the Beechwood Airship interviews that you mentioned, I was fortunate enough to interview Judi Dench a number of times, and she told me this. She said when she is acting or preparing for a role, she always tries to be the big eye and the big ear and take it all in, because you never know what will be useful. And I really took that on in terms of writing, because I think, everything is interesting until it proves to be, unuseful or boring. So I always try and sort of be a big sponge for that sort of thing.
You just summarised what I've always considered this fantastic festival to be about as well, because it is called the Edward Stanford Travel Writing Festival, not the Edward Stanford Arrival Writing Festival or Hotel Writing Festival or Coming Home Writing Festival. It is about the act of journey. The old trope, it's better to travel than to arrive, is often the case. Can we come to the first of the outposts that you visited? Why did you pick on Mars? It seems an awfully long way away, but also very timely, given that we've learned very recently that Elon Musk, who is very keen for a lot of us to go and live on Mars, has just been nominated or just been discovered to be the wealthiest man on the world, overtaking Jeff Bezos, and of course is very invested in SpaceX and taking a lot of species on Ark-like spaceships off to Mars to terraform it. So why Mars?
In terms of Mars, I mean, as you say, it does seem weirdly relevant. In fact, the whole book seems quite relevant, because I was seeking solitude and, to get away from everything, and often to get away from everything to quite enclosed or outlying places. And this was at a time when one could travel. And the idea of solitude now is obviously incredibly sort of prescient, because the idea of the mental health of the people who've been locked down, everything like that, and people in extremis, and here we are. The idea of Mars for me has always been terrifying, because whilst not claustrophobic at the time, I'm quite claustrophobic in retrospect, I think. I discovered when I was climbing mountains for the mountaineering book that I don't have a fear of heights, I don't have vertigo, but I do get very sort of like frightened in retrospect when I think back to what I just did. I think, blimey, why did I do that? I mean, I'm surprised I'm still here. And a number of the reviews said exactly the same thing. And it turns out that having your life saved by your mountaineering guide when you go through a snow cornice is one of the most boring things to ever happen to you, in terms of just, you just get on with it, you're shouted at a lot, and you carry on. And then when you finished it, you get the shakes. You're like, blimey, I'm glad he was there. Otherwise, that very blunt German glacier that was quite a long way below would have rapidly introduced itself. And so, in terms of travel and Mars, the idea of being on Mars, that's exciting to me. But the idea of getting to Mars, as I discovered, is, catastrophically scary, in as much as you would be in a crew of between 3 and 5 people with modern technology, today's technology, and you would travel out from the Earth when Mars was going to be nearest, so the orbits would intersect in that way. And it would take you about 18 months to get there, maybe 2 years. And then you would be there, because obviously the world and Earth and Mars are moving. You'd either be there for about a month, which is scientifically sort of unhelpful and also a terrible waste of Elon Musk's money, or you'd be there for a number of years, and then it would be 18 months, 2 years to come back. So the sort of people they send are going to be the exact opposite of the Apollo astronauts, who were jump jet pilots, effectively, who could solve emergencies in a hurry. And when you consider the moon is 48 hours away, Mars is 18 months to 2 years away. So they're going to send a group of people who, are good at dealing with things slowly, very methodically, and can block out the white noise of constant panic about being in a capsule heading as fast as possible away from a habitable planet towards one that is not, for a number of years. And I was thinking about this when I started Outpost, because I thought the idea of, having civilization, explore other worlds, it's always been a fascination to us. But what is the reality of this? And my ideas come from visual things, because I'm quite a visual person. And I found this amazing magazine called Avant. And on the cover, they had a picture of, as far as I could tell, an astronaut walking through snow towards mountains. And it was just the most amazing shot. And I thought, where has this been taken? And what's the story behind this picture? And I discovered that the Mars Society, who are an American-based organization, have a number of what they call habs, or habitats, that they've set up in different parts of the Earth that most closely resemble elements of the Martian landscape. They have one up in Newfoundland, which is the Arctic Hab, and they have one called the Mars Desert Research Station, and that's in Utah. And before the Curiosity rover went and actually landed on Mars and began doing its experiments, they decided that this red desert in a very unpopulated part of Utah, which is frankly saying something, was very similar to what they could see and sort of discern from Mars. So they built this, a sort of Mars village, I suppose, a Mars research station. And then they began putting would-be Martian explorers through their psychological paces. And it's very interesting because, of course, Utah, you don't need a pressurized suit to walk around a Utah desert. And they have these suits, and they don't have air circulating, and they have these airlocks that technically they don't need in Utah. So it's this amazing sort of symbiosis, I suppose, and juxtaposition of the childlike pretend, where now you stand in an airlock for 5 minutes, even though you need the loo, or you're really hungry, or you're tired, or you're really hot, because that is what you would do on Mars. And now you're going out on your moon buggy, Mars buggy, and you're going to explore, and you have to do everything like you would. And it's amazing how after 2 weeks, people have psychic breaks. People just have enough after 2 weeks. And when you consider that it's the time frames involved, it's extraordinary. So, yes, I traveled down there as the sort of, I suppose, inquisitive idiot by the standards of a lot of the scientists, and just asked quite naive questions like, what sort of person volunteers for this sort of thing? What sort of person wants to go to Mars? Have you ever had people completely freak out? Because at a human interest level, that's quite interesting. And yes, they have. But it was a great privilege to be there. And again, I mean, whoever thinks of visiting these places, they're not really on the map for several reasons. And it was a great privilege to be sort of allowed to donder about.
There are a number of things that I drew from that chapter, which I really liked, which is some of the best people who are best suited to it are the sort of calm people with quite a good interior hinterland. So an oil rig engineer is one person that the person that runs the place pointed out. And I rather like the little observation, some of the observations. He was used to being on his own. He's used to being self-sufficient. He's used to fixing stuff. On he's very, bright. Obviously, a very cool guy. I also like the observation that the fantastic woman who had invited you and who was talking you through it, that at the end of the day, she'd go back to her trailer, which had satellite television and all the stuff that you need, whereas all you guys in the hab were still effectively on Mars, that, just for the sake of a short car ride or a walk away around the other side of the compound, she was living on Earth, but you in your heads were all living on Mars. I rather like that a lot. Can we come to Iceland now, please, Dan? And I have to ask you, I've tried to do some research on the Icelandic alphabet. One, because there's a name that you have for the organization that run a series of huts across Iceland, across the interior. And as you very ably point out, that most of Iceland most of the island inhabitants live on the outside of the island, and the central bit, the interior, is not so habited. But there's a fantastic word, and I can't find it now when I want to, of course, which is the hut people. Who are the hut people?
They're the Islands. Because one of the amazing things is I did the audiobook for this, and it's quite chastening as a travel writer. You go around the world and you go to Japan and Iceland and various places, and then you come to do the audiobook. I mean, you go to Scotland, the amount of mountains sort of like north of here, and you just think, oh, why didn't I go to Luton? I could pronounce that. But yes, that was quite an exciting thing. Like the Silahus, which is the cabin that I visited, spent most of my time in Iceland at. I was calling Hivitans, or something like Hivitans for years.
Verton or something like that. Yes.
Verton, and it's Kvitanus.
Oh, is it? I've got that hopelessly wrong as well then.
Yeah, exactly. So I've been doing talks for years talking about Hevitans, and people have been smiling and nodding politely. And Kvitanus, it's not the same thing. So yeah, it's an interesting one, the Icelandic language. And I think it's just when you hear someone like Björk speak, the fact that she speaks English so beautifully, I think comes from the fact that you have this amazing ancient land. You can show Icelandic children runes from millennia ago, and they can tell you exactly what they mean. In this, you can't show British children, hieroglyphics from the Bronze.
Sure.
No, exactly. So it was an interesting one. I went up there because I discovered that the Icelandic, as you say, the interior of Iceland is unpopulated. But for generations and generations, people have had to make the journey from one side of the island to the other, and they can't always go around the coast. So they've had to make these interior journeys through the hinterland. And they built a series of what we would now consider, I suppose, kind of kit and food dumps across the interior, so they could join those dots. So the ancient Norse could get to the Parliament Stone and various things. And these kit dumps often took the form of a human-made cave in a way, because if you imagine you're in a sort of tundric landscape, very flat, very cold, there's nothing to build with. I was told in Svalbard, and I think it holds true for Iceland as well, that if you're ever lost in a forest, you just need to sit up, because the greenery is incredibly stunted because of the very harsh weather. And in the interior of Iceland, you're not going to find a forest to build a cabin with. You might, if you're lucky, find a cave or a rock. So they built these turf and stone igloos called Silahus, which are roughly translates as House of Joy. And you can imagine your troop of Norsemen coming across and finding somewhere where they could all sort of like huddle down and have some food and not be in a howling gale. And it would very much be a house of joy. And over the years and the millennia, like the ship of Theseus, these these igloos have turned into cabins for use by modern day hikers. And some of them sit in landscape where they are the only sort of human sort of punctuation within a vast scape, perhaps apart from the track that leads to them. And the place that I went, Kvitanus, is on a very, very old road and was heavily, I suppose, it had an atmosphere, Paul, shall we say.
Just one thing before we come to a reading that you very kindly offered to do for us. For those whose Greek mythology is not so Greek, do tell us about the ship of Theseus, because I have to confess, I'd learnt this as a kid, subsequently forgotten it, and your fantastic footnotes that pepper your narrative in this book reminded me of something that I previously had forgotten, which was such a joy. Can you just revise Ship of Theseus for us, please?
I mean, the modern equivalent of Ship of Theseus is Trigger's broom from Only Fools and Horses, where Trigger, who sweeps the market, is awarded a plaque, I think, by the council for never having had to have a new broom. And when he receives it, he goes, "Oh yeah, this broom's great. 29 handles and 45 new brushes, but I never actually replaced it." And Ship of Theseus is very much the same, where Theseus's ship was rebuilt. And the philosophical question goes, was it still the Ship of Theseus if you replace every single element, but it still maintains its form? It's a very roundabout answer for you there. So these cabins, it's amazing when you see the different silo hosts, the forms they take. Some form the most amazing aluminium KLF-like pyramids, and some look like schools made of corrugated iron, and some, like Kvitanus, which I visited, they look like a sort of Nordic bunkhouse. And it's very much up to the local population, which is quite sparse at times, as to what form these buildings took, if any. I mean, some are still, hidden and existing as, very small caves, effectively.
The reading you've kindly offered to do for us takes us straight into the heart of Iceland, to one of these houses of joy, and to a rather disturbing story. So, for those of you of a sensitive disposition, you may want to listen away now, unless you're happy with ghosts.
Here we go. This place we are going is a very haunted house, Stefan had announced on the drive out. And I should say, Stefan was the most amazing carpenter who I went out with. And we also had another chap with us because we were rebuilding and refurbishing Kvitanus. And the other chap was called Atli. And there was a dog named Hekla. And Hekla is the big volcano that's shortly to go off in Iceland. So you'll remember that name shortly, I'm sure. So he told me the place was very haunted. "Oh, yes," I'd asked. "Oh, yes," he'd repeated, whilst Atli nodded assent. But that was as far as we'd got in the 4x4. At dinner, the first night, he told me the story. "You notice that this house is built near some old farm ruins," he began, pointing to a series of hummocks outside. "Well, there lived a farmer and his wife, and they had a girl working too. The farmer tried to sleep with the girl, but she said no. And so in revenge, he locked her outside in a snowstorm. So she died, and the farmer was killed by his wife to avenge the poor girl." That's the most Icelandic story you will ever hear. If you're expecting more, that's entirely it. Stefan ended this story with a meaningful look. "I see," I said. Then we walked around to the room next door, where there was a bunk bed built at 90 degrees to all the other bunks. "That's the bad bed," he told me. "That's built across a doorway. Sleep there and the girl runs through you." Atli nodded, and so did I. But strange as this might sound, none of it seemed abnormal. Kvitanes existed in a land apart, completely other, with its own unique light and gravity. I remember sitting upstairs shortly after the ghost conversation, upstairs in the loft, gable window open, listening to Doppler geese flying over the flats. I grew to love and set aside this golden hour around midnight, when the sun, skimming low over the glacier snout ahead, coppered the silo house front and lit the grass and sedgeland red. A days of heaven light spun gold. Some nights I'd stand in the front door and watch sun surf across the swells of grass, a leopard print sea rolling out to the white mountains and glass of the horizon. The riverbanks before the house were soft as soot, the glacier face implacable enamel, beaming a hypnotic Cheshire cat charisma, pearly and cruel. The panorama spread vast and cold, wind-skimmed, assailed, I should say. In terms of work, we rebuilt one side of the Silahouse. The frozen turf ramparts having been dug away, we levered off the cabin's tin cladding to reveal the timbers underneath, then set about replacing rotten planking and posts, burning scrap and offcuts in the kitchen stove. And one afternoon, we had the little burner running full blast in a room with no walls, and I thought of Phileas Fogg on the steamboat Henrietta, burning all the wooden parts of his ship to keep up steam, having run out of coal mid-Atlantic, and us, puffing away on the shining marshes, our little crew, renewing the good ship Kvitanes for voyages to come. Next morning, I descended the stair ladder from the loft to find Atli cooking breakfast and Stefan sitting red-eyed on his bunk. He looked a washed-out wreck. "The ghost," he said flatly, massaging his nose. "I had a long night with the ghost." He described his haunting as a series of dreams, dreams within a dream, none of them good. He'd been woken by a weight on his chest, something pinning him, pressing so that he could not breathe. He tried not to panic. He asked it to please get off him. He was polite. Unnatural silence, not quiet, a total lack of sound, apart from his breathing, shallow and creaking. He was not sleeping in the bad bunk, but a lower bunk in the front room where we all ate. Still held fast, the slats of the bed above a few inches from his nose, he began to talk, as best he could. Talk about the work we were doing on the cabin, the fact that we were repairing the building, respecting the fabric of the place and landscape, explaining that he meant no harm. Then it was gone. The ghost, the presence, the weight, and he closed his wet eyes and filled his pained lungs and turned to sit sideways out of the bunk, head in hands, aware that oily twilight was pooling in the room. After an indeterminate time, minutes or hours, he climbed the stair ladder to Atli's room and got into bed with him. Atli woke up and turned wide-eyed, and Stefan opened his mouth to explain and woke downstairs with an apparition pressing on his chest. He could not breathe. This happened a number of times. "I'm part troll, so I can deal with it," he told me with a wry smile, but he looked utterly knackered, like a man who'd fought his way out of a supernatural tumble dryer.
Dan Richards reading a fantastic, true Icelandic ghost story from his latest work entitled Outpost, beautifully published by Canongate. What's interesting about that is, of course, there are quite a lot of other documented examples of people who have spent nights in that hut and decided either never to go back or have got out in the middle of the night and gone to camp instead, right up to present day.
Terrible hauntings with lights and, violent sort of noises happening in the middle of the night and people being apparently lifted up and put on the roof and various things. They all are terribly frightening. And then they write a long form essay about it in the guest book, which is still in the cabin. I did find it slightly disconcerting, but yes, there have been a number of sort of amazing things, and some of them are quite Enid Blyton, and some of them are quite Scooby-Doo. But yeah, it is. You can see when you get there, it's the most amazing place, and it has the second largest glacier in Iceland in front of it, which I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce. But it dominates everything. So it really does feel charged. I think Rebecca Solnit talks about landscapes who actually, being in charge. You don't project onto the landscape projects onto you. And more than projecting, it was electrifying. It really was. And the fact that we were there at a time of year when it was pretty much 24-hour daylight, it did lead to these strange feelings and phenomena.
I really, the Icelandic piece that you wrote is just fantastic. I like also, I mean, I have to say, your footnotes are spectacular. I have a problem with footnotes because I never know to read them where I'm meant to read them, where you get the little numbers one or the asterisk or so on, or to save them all up to the end and read them as a sort of separate codicil to the book. And I did both with you. The words I was looking for earlier on, well, is it far-flung Islands?
Yes, Iceland. Yes.
Far-flung Islands, yeah, exactly. Really nice. Dan, can you whisk us now from Iceland to the Cascade Mountains, where you had just what seemed to me the perfect sense of an outpost, as most of us would have understood it prior to reading your book? A very clear sort of island in a wilderness.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the wonderful things about writing a book is that you do research and you read books around the subject that you're dealing with. Um, Jack Kerouac is somebody who I've read in the past, and I really really like his travel essays. But when I was starting out, I discovered not so much a contemporary, but somebody who uses the same kind of language in a more perhaps, I suppose, visceral way, perhaps, than Kerouac. I don't know if that's fair, but a chap called Dennis Johnson. He wrote the most amazing book called
Yeah.
Train Dreams, which manages to condense the life of a man, Robert Grainer, into, who lives a very long time. If you imagine Dorothy Pilley's amazing life condensed into a novella, I would never attempt such a thing, but this book manages to do that with the story of a man. And I began reading that, and I began thinking about fire cabins because Dennis Johnson lived in the Idaho Panhandle, where they have a lot of cabins up on stilts, exactly as you say, perhaps as everyone would imagine them. And I booked myself a stay in this big tower cabin because when they were are retired, the National Park Service rent these amazing structures, which were once used so that men, mainly veterans or beat poets, as it turns out, could scan a vast expanse of forested wilderness and call in any lightning strikes, smoke, fires that they saw so that the timber could be protected. And there was an amazing high tower cabin called Big Creek Baldy Lookout. And I'm not even going to pretend that, even if it had been the worst cabin in the world, I would have gone there because I'm a writer and you want to go to Big Creek Baldy Lookout if you're doing anything. So I tried to go there and I had it all booked. And pretty much as I was leaving the UK to fly over to the States, I got an email from the National Park Service to tell me that I wasn't going to be able to stay there because the whole area around Big Creek Baldy Lookout was on fire, which rather raises the question of why it was retired in the first place. But I had to, sort of come up with a new plan. And so I set my sights instead on Desolation Peak. Desolation Peak, perhaps the most famous fire lookout cabin in the States, because it was there in 1956, I think, that Jack Kerouac spent just over 2 months as a fire lookout. And this was at a time in Kerouac's life where he hadn't made any sort of splash. He published one book and it had done absolutely nothing. And he decided that being a watchman for 2 months, you would have enough liberty and freedom to really get some writing done. And he wrote about this book. He wrote about his stay in several books, because a year to the day that he left, On the Road was published, and he never had peace and quiet again. He was just a public property by then. So he went up there, and Desolation Peak is in the middle of the Cascade Mountains. It's in Washington State. The nearest big city is Seattle. It's up towards the Canadian border. And the Cascade Mountains are a vast area of pretty much unspoilt mountains and timber. You had Gary Schneider there, who was a fellow lookout, and Philip Whalen, who was also another beat poet lookout, and they were all amongst there. I think the first highway went through in the 70s. So you have to imagine that these young guys are up there, and the only light they would have seen was another beat poet up on a different mountain, on the same beat in terms of fire sort of precaution. And Kerouac was there, And it's kind of become a bit of a fire lookout mecca. So people will go on kind of beat pilgrimages to see him. And whenever I am writing a book, there is always a moment that I know is the high risk moment of the book, because I knew that I would get into the middle of the wilderness area, which wasn't that easy to do. And then you've got to get up a lake. And luckily, I found a man in a plaid shirt who looked a bit like Neil Young with a boat. And I would say that was a piece of luck, but he charged me more than a kidney to get up the lake. So that was chastening. And then you get up there and then you hike up the mountain, and you know that because Desolation Peak is still manned, there's still a watchman in there. I knew that there would be a man up there, and he wouldn't know that I was coming, because you can't stay there. It's still a working, vedette in that way. And he would either say, "Wonderful to meet you. Hello, would you like a coffee? Let's have a chat about what I do and what this place is." Or he would say, "Bugger off." And that was really going to affect how this chapter went, because, I'm not from Washington State. I'm from Bristol. And, I've got a long way. And if you meet a man at the top of a quite important mountain and he's fundamentally unhelpful, that's going to affect things. But it turned out to be a man called Jim Henterley, who is the most extraordinary, I'm still in touch with him, the most extraordinary individual. He's an artist. He was in the paratroopers, in Vietnam and various things. He's a medic. And as I say, we're still in touch with each other. So we got up there, and I went with my friend, Colin. We both hiked up there, met Jim, had a coffee. It was wonderful. Pitched our tent a bit further down the mountain. Later that night, we got bothered by a bear. And as you know, what's bad in life is often good in a book. So the fact that if you live to tell the tale, it's a good story. That's generally my idea. So, and then we went back up the next day, had a chat with Jim, and then it was just brilliant. Because also when we got up there, you had this amazing moment where the whole mountain swelled with alpenglow. It was like everything was covered in the most amazing gold leaf, sort of rose gold. Everything went rose gold for about 5-10 minutes. And we were talking to Jim about his life and about Kerouac's life, and that moment in time, and how it still functions, and how Jim is actually a very important man in terms of a radio relayer, because Desolation Peak sits at a point where radio signals from this side can't easily get to that side. They still use, shortwave from the main base in Marble Mount. So he's this dispatcher as much as anything else. And just the most amazing coffee I've ever had, because I was absolutely knackered. And because of the man with the boat, I couldn't afford any coffee anymore. So that happened. And then it went black. It went black blue, because that was night, and you had the perfect sky, and you had all of the stars, and you had the Canadian border over there. And then later we were woken up by a bear. As a travel writer, you really can't get a better sort of 12 hours than that, really. It was fantastic.
And you had a coffee in the fire lookout outpost where Jack Kerouac had sat smoking coffee because he'd run out of tobacco. That's got to be good.
Yeah, it was great. I mean, I learned so much about Kerouac as well writing that chapter, and the fact that really he was a self-made man, in the sense of everyone thinks of him as this kind of like frontiersman, hobo, man cub, bebop kind of, incredibly adept person. But he kind of freaked out, and I think, he ran out of coffee, and then he ran out of tobacco. And then he was smoking coffee grounds and pretty much had to be rescued. But every time he wrote about this, he rebuilt himself as a better version of himself. It's a sad story, but it's really interesting. I could really relate to it.
But it's a great story of the making of an artist and the freeing of an artistic soul. Dan, we don't have an enormous amount of time left. I want to end on a slightly philosophical note, if you'll permit me. We live in a time where there are too damn many of us on the planet, and those of us who live in the first world and have the means, although we're getting fewer and fewer, like to go to such places. We like to visit wildernesses. There are a number of incidents in this book which are startling and scary. We'll take the Mars one first of all. The lady who organizes the Mars thing, I can't remember her name, forgive me, I apologize to you, madam, but has to spend quite a lot of time picking up rubbish from what is the surface of Mars from student tours that go there where people leave their wrappers. You also explain there's a lovely, very poignant moment in Iceland where people are not treating these fantastic houses of joy in the manner that in the past they would have been treated, with respect. So if you light a fire, you clear the grate out, you collect your Kit Kat wrappers and so on. Can you just talk about to us, please, about what you learned about the responsibility of visiting these wilderness, the responsibility of visiting these outposts, and in fact, whether it is philosophically appropriate for us to do so? I came up with a phrase some years ago that if David Attenborough's been there, we don't have to. He's done it for us and we can leave it in peace. And I'm beginning to think increasingly, although this is, of course, a travel writing festival, there is a need to travel, that maybe what travel writing does is preserve these places so fewer people go there. Can you tease through the philosophy of that for me a little?
Sure. I think, there's been quite a lot of conversation recently about the idea of being good ancestors. Are we leaving a planet in the best possible condition for our children and their children? If I fly up to Svalbard to look at the polar bears, or I take a cruise there, am I doing a disservice to the place I'm going? Because as you say, there are too many people going. Why am I going, and how am I going? Quite a lot of the book is an exploration of those ideas to some degree. There was an amazing moment in Svalbard where I had been traveling around on a snowmobile. I grew to dislike snowmobiles. It's like going around on an angry wasp with a puncture. And of course, you see other people coming the other way, and you think, oh, it's such a shame that they're here. And of course, they think exactly the same thing about you going in the different direction. And then I went out with a dog sled, and suddenly everything made far more sense because you're traveling at an animal pace. Everything is pretty much silent. You're in the company of somebody who is from that world, a Scandinavian, because Svalbard is as a Norwegian archipelago. And you're there with someone with knowledge, and you haven't just done this thing. There's the equivalent I draw is seagull management, which is something that happens, I think, in business. Seagull management is defined as flying in, making a lot of noise, pooping over everything, and then flying off again. And there are some middle managers that do this. I never want to be that sort of tourist. I never want to go and do the thing that everyone is doing for the Instagram pictures that everyone already has, so that I can say that I've ticked it off a bucket list. I think bucket lists are really much, they're helping the planet kick the bucket as much as they're, fulfilling the dreams of people who sort of have had this longed for passion, to go up Everest because no one's done that. And then you see the queues and you see the death and all of this. It's not to say that one shouldn't go, but I don't see the point, to echo yourself, I don't see the point of going where everyone else has been, because that's not being an individual. That's joining a queue. I think we have to, for the sake of the planet and also for the sake of, having a good time, because that is important if you're traveling. I think we have to be more imaginative about where we go, how we go, and why we're going. And there were quite a number of places that I wanted to go to in the book, quite key, places for me and my story that I ended up not going to, because why would you go if you're going to do harm? First, do no harm. As you would treat your own body, treat the planet likewise.
Yes, exactly. We sadly have to leave it there. Can I just say that we may have touched a little bit on Iceland, on Mars via Utah, and on Desolation Peak in the US. But there's Scotland, there's France, there's Switzerland, there's Japan, and there's Svalbard, all tucked into this. And you have to read it to answer the story to why everything that happened in Scotland is Dan Friend's Steve's fault, even though he won't admit it.
Sadly.
You won't, sadly, but it is. Dan, it's been such a pleasure. Can I ask finally, what are you working on now? What can we expect you on in the future? And just also to say, I'm so sorry. Congratulations on this book. It really is a tour de force. It's a fantastic piece of work. It's beautifully written. And anybody who can angle a Charlie Parker footnote into a piece about the Cascade Mountains via the Beat Poets certainly gets my vote.
Well, you're very kind. My next project is an exploration of the things that happen at night to preserve and reset and really just sort of keep safe the world while most of us are asleep. And so I'll be talking to all sorts of people there, near and far, about who keeps the planes in the sky and who, sorts out all the stuff that we wake up expecting to be there in the morning. So people from the Royal Mail, people in the NHS, people in the museums, people on the transport network. Really just, again, it's me going and talking to people about their stories and about perhaps lives and adventures that pass unnoticed but are vital to keep the world spinning.
Here comes the night mail crossing the border, bringing the check and the postal order, as the fantastic Barry once went. I look forward to that. That sounds a brilliant piece of work.
Thank you.
On behalf of the Edward Stanford Travel Writing Festival 2021, the online edition, thank you so much for coming to join us, Dan Richards. Congratulations on Outpost. It's a fantastic book. There'll be a way to buy it at the bottom of this page, but just to reiterate, this is what it looks like in paperback with all my reading notes on. We look forward to seeing you at the next event. Take care of yourselves, travel well, travel wisely, and travel with as little impact as possible. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you, Dan and Paul, for that event. Well, we heard there about Dan's next project, but why wait when you can delve into his book, Outpost, A Journey to the Wild Ends of the Earth, available now at stanfords.co.uk. And to finish, let's leave an echo of Dan's words. First, do no harm. As you would treat your own body, treat the planet likewise.